The Marquis of Hartwell said it at supper, to 3 men who would repeat it, and he meant it as a dismissal. She was standing at the far end of the gallery when he said it, close enough to have heard every syllable through the open door had she not been occupied with something more pressing than the opinions of men who had never opened an account ledger in their lives. The gallery of Pembridge House ran the full length of the east wing, and someone had placed the floral arrangements incorrectly, each silver urn stationed 2 feet too far from the pilasters, so that the candlelight caught the vases and threw long shadows across the portraits, rather than illuminating them as the evening required. Miss Eleanor Marsh had been correcting the placement silently for the past 20 minutes, shifting each urn by measured inches while 200 guests swept past her in silk and feathers and conversation that filled the rooms like water filling a basin. She wore gray. She always wore gray at events like these, because gray was the color of someone who worked, and working was what she did. Her gloves were clean but inexpensive. Her hair was arranged with precision and no ornament. She was 26 years old and had been managing the Pemberton household for 3 years without a title, without a wage that reflected the labor, and without a single person in that gallery having registered her name. And at the edge of all that gilded, perfumed spectacle, methodically repositioning the 7th silver urn so that the candlelight fell properly across Lord Pembridge's grandfather, was Eleanor Marsh. The Duke of Caldwell arrived at 9:30. She did not see him enter. She heard the particular quality of silence that moved through a room when someone of genuine rank crossed its threshold, not the performed stillness of people pretending not to stare, but the organic quiet of 200 people recalibrating where their attention should be. She straightened from the urn she had just adjusted, turned, and saw him. He was tall, dressed in black from throat to boot, and he moved through the gallery the way a man moves through a room he does not particularly want to be in but has decided to complete. He was not dazzled by the chandeliers. He did not pause to admire the arrangements. He accepted a glass from a footman without looking at it, and let his gaze move across the room with the unhurried focus of someone conducting an inspection. His gaze passed the expected woman, Lady Sophronia Vane, an ivory tool, positioned at the room's best angle, with the particular artfulness of a woman who had been told since childhood that a room's best angle was hers by right. His gaze passed Lord Pembridge's cluster of investors. It passed 3 marchionesses and a minor prince. It stopped on Eleanor. Not with desire. She knew desire. She had watched men directed at the wrong women for years. This was something else. The measuring attention of a man who has identified something he does not yet have a category for. He looked at her the way a good surveyor looks at an unexpected load-bearing wall. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Then a footman spoke to him, and he turned away. Eleanor picked up her list and continued. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. The Marquis of Hartwell's voice carried through the open dining room door 20 minutes later, distinct above the music and the murmur of guests. "She is not the kind of woman men remember," he said, and his companions laughed, and Eleanor adjusted the final urn and did not alter her expression by a fraction. She was aware, in a manner she had long ago decided was simply practical and not grievous, that he was correct in the narrow sense he meant. She had not been remembered. She had been managed and assigned and called upon and handed the next impossible thing, but she had not been remembered. There was a difference, and she understood it clearly, and she had made her peace with it, in the same way she had made her peace with a great many structural facts about the world she occupied. Not by ceasing to mind them, but by deciding that minding them would cost energy she needed for other purposes. What the Marquis of Hartwell did not know, could not know, and would spend the next 4 months discovering whether he chose to or not, was that the Duke of Caldwell had turned back to look at her a second time. She did not know it either, not yet. Eleanor Marsh had been born the only daughter of a land surveyor who understood numbers the way other men understood horses, intuitively, physically, with a bodily pleasure in their arrangement. Her father, George Marsh, had died of a fever in the autumn of 1843, when Eleanor was 17, leaving behind a survey practice with 11 active contracts, a house with a modest mortgage, a workshop full of excellent instruments, and an estate in the small Surrey village of Hurst Green that had belonged to his employer, Lord Pembridge, and which had, without anyone formally deciding as much, begun to be managed by Eleanor the morning after her father's funeral. Lord Pembridge was her father's employer and her mother's distant cousin, which put Eleanor in a social position that had no clean name, not a servant, not family, not a guest, not a professional, but some composite of all four that meant she could be assigned any of the labor with none of the standing. Her mother had died the previous spring. There was no one else. She had taken her father's survey notes from the workshop the week after the funeral and spent 3 days reviewing them, not from grief. She grieved her father in the only way she knew, which was to find out what state he had left things in and address it. What she found was that the Pembridge tenant farms were in a considerably more precarious condition than Lord Pembridge knew, that 2 of the farm leases had clauses which technically permitted Pembridge's primary creditor to accelerate the outstanding loan if the southern fields went fallow, and that the southern fields were, in fact, about to go fallow because the tenant farmer responsible for them, a man named Duckworth, had been trying to tell Lord Pembridge this for the past 6 months, and had been deflected each time by the steward, who was avoiding the information because the information reflected poorly on his management. Eleanor had drafted a letter to Duckworth that afternoon, walked to his farm the following morning, and negotiated a modified planting arrangement that kept the southern fields in production at reduced cost. She had revised the lease clause herself, written a clean copy in her best hand, and placed it before Lord Pembridge with a brief explanation. Lord Pembridge, who was a decent man if not a particularly attentive one, had signed it without fully reading it. That was 1843. By 1846, Eleanor was managing the accounts for all 6 Pembridge tenant farms, conducting the annual creditor negotiations, supervising the household expenditure review each quarter, and producing the investment reports that Lord Pembridge presented to his circle as his own work. He did not present them as her work because it did not occur to him that this was a deception. She sat in the morning room, and she was good with figures, and the figures needed doing, and she was there. She was not paid what a steward would have been paid. She was not paid what an estate manager would have been paid. She received an allowance that covered her clothing and her room, and a small sum she saved with the same disciplined consistency she brought to everything else. In 4 years she had saved £32, which was not enough to change her situation, but was enough to know that she had not been entirely without will in it. The specific moment she chose not to become less than she was happened in the spring of 1845. Lord Pembridge had hired a new steward, a man named Griggs, who arrived with credentials from a Norfolk estate and a manner that communicated, precisely and continuously, that he considered it irregular and slightly absurd that a young woman was involved in the accounts at all. He reviewed Eleanor's work for the first week with an expression of studied neutrality that conveyed displeasure more effectively than any words could have. In the second week, he began revising her figures without consulting her, entering different tallies in the ledger in a different hand, and leaving the altered columns for her to find when she came in each morning. The figures were not wrong. That was the precise and maddening thing. Griggs was numerically competent, and his revisions were defensible, and he was doing it not because her work was incorrect, but because her work was hers, and he wanted it to be his, and because the quickest way to make a thing yours is to alter it until it carries your hand. Eleanor had sat with the altered ledger for a long time one morning, pressing one hand briefly against the morning room wall, feeling the plaster solid under her palm. She was not going to step aside for anyone. She had prepared over the next 4 days, a complete parallel set of accounts, every transaction for the preceding 18 months, annotated, with her original entries and Griggs's revisions noted in adjacent columns, with a third column showing the variance in projected margin over the 5-year farm cycle. The document was 11 pages. She had presented it to Lord Pembridge on a Tuesday morning, with the same tone she used to present any operational document, which was the tone of a person who has assembled facts and now offers them for review. Griggs was reassigned to the northern property within a fortnight. Lord Pembridge never mentioned it directly. Eleanor returned to the accounts, and the accounts were hers again, and that was that. She had brought everything she had, and she put it to work. What she had not done, in 9 years of this labor, was allow herself to name what she was. She was not a steward. She was not an estate manager. She was not a secretary or an accountant or an agent, because none of those categories existed with a female designation in her world. She was the Pembridge's cousin who was good with figures and helpful about the house, and the figure had no weight and the help had no name, and she had made her peace with the naming while refusing, in every practical particular, to make peace with the invisibility. She brought the accounts for the Pembridge investment portfolio to the supper events because the investors attended the supper events and the investment conversations happened there, and Lord Pembridge preferred to have her nearby during those conversations so that she could supply figures when figures were required, which was often. She stood at the edges of those rooms with a leather folio of documents, and she answered questions directed through Lord Pembridge to her, and the investors looked at the figures she produced and nodded, and occasionally asked follow-up questions that she answered through the same formal triangulation, and none of them ever looked at her face. The Duke of Caldwell was the first investor in 7 years who had looked at her face. She did not know what to make of that. She picked up her list and continued. The Duke of Caldwell had been 22 years old when his mother died, and he had never, in the 14 years since, found a way to describe what that had done to him that did not sound like an excuse. So he did not describe it. He managed the dukedom, expanded the investment portfolio, maintained Caldwell Park with the precision of a man who understood that an estate is a machine, and machines require maintenance, and attended social obligations with the practiced appearance of someone who was present when he was, in all material respects, somewhere else entirely. He had not chosen Eleanor Marsh by accident. 3 weeks before the Pembridge supper he had received a report from his solicitor, a careful man named Edward Whitmore, who had been tasked with investigating the actual financial management of the Pembridge estate, following some concerns raised during investment discussions. Whitmore's report was 12 pages and contained, in its 7th page, the following observation: the investment summaries provided to the Pembridge Investor Circle are produced by Miss Eleanor Marsh, a resident of the household without formal appointment. Examination of the accounts suggests Miss Marsh has been managing the full estate financial operations for a period of not less than 7 years. The quality of the work is of a standard I would characterize as exceptional. The arrangements by which she does so are, in my view, informally exploitative. Whitmore was not a man who used words like exceptional without having examined the alternatives. Caldwell had read that sentence twice. Then he had read the attached financial summaries, Eleanor's summaries, though they bore Pembridge's name, with the attention of a man who spent a significant portion of his professional life reviewing financial documents. They were not merely competent. They were structured with an architectural intelligence he recognized, the kind of intelligence that did not merely record figures but understood what the figures meant about the farm cycle and the creditor position and the market timing, and built the summaries accordingly, so that the figures told a story rather than merely populating columns. He had asked Whitmore to find out whether she had any formal interest in a different situation. Whitmore had reported back that Miss Marsh was not known to be seeking any situation, that she appeared to have no professional connections outside the Pembridge household, and that the household appeared to be unaware that retaining her without adequate compensation was in any sense irregular. Caldwell had attended the Pembridge supper with the specific intention of seeing her work in person. He had not expected the gray dress and the silver urns. He had not expected the complete absence of self-consciousness she brought to an act of domestic correction in the middle of a gilded gallery, the manner of someone doing their job in a room full of people whose jobs, mostly, involved wearing expensive things and standing at advantageous angles. He had not expected the stillness. He had looked at her for 4 seconds and placed her exactly the way a good engineer places a component, not because it fits the anticipated shape, but because it fits the actual load. He had turned away because he needed to speak with Whitmore, and because he did not want to stare. He had, after those conversations, turned back. She was already gone from the gallery. He found her 20 minutes later, in the corridor outside Lord Pembridge's study, seated on a narrow chair with the leather folio open across her knees, reviewing a column of figures with the concentrated attention of someone who has found a discrepancy and is determining its source. He stopped in the corridor entrance. She did not look up for a long moment, and then she did, with the particular stillness of someone who has been doing precise work and has had to set it down. "Your Grace," she said, not flustered, not performing composure, simply composed. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I believe you prepared the Pembridge investment summary for the 3rd quarter. A brief pause. "Lord Pembridge prepared it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Then Lord Pembridge has an excellent understanding of creditor acceleration clauses and farm cycle margin variance." She said nothing. Her hands were quiet on the folio. "I am meeting with the Investor Council in 6 weeks," he said. "I am reorganizing the Caldwell estate portfolio, and I require someone with genuine competence at the financial documentation. I would like to know whether you would consider a formal position." He paused. "A salaried position, with a proper written agreement," and looked at him for a long moment, not with surprise, and not with gratitude, and not with any of the rapid recalculations he had expected. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been presented with a figure they need to check before accepting. "I would need to see the terms," she said. He had expected nothing less. "Whitmore will call on you Tuesday," he said. He had stood in the corridor outside the Pembridge study on 3 subsequent evenings, reviewing his investment papers, because it was a quiet place to work and because he had, on the 3rd evening, admitted to himself that it was not entirely the quiet he had come for. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. So for the 6 days between the corridor conversation and Whitmore's Tuesday call, Eleanor continued with the Pembridge accounts and the quarterly creditor review and the preparation of the upcoming investment summaries, and she did not think about the Duke of Caldwell's offer, because thinking about it would accomplish nothing useful until she had seen the terms. She thought about it constantly. Whitmore arrived on Tuesday at 11 with a folder of papers, a mild manner, and the look of a man who found this particular situation quietly gratifying. He was 63, had served the Caldwell ducal interests for 20 years, and had spent a portion of those years watching people less capable than Eleanor Marsh receive appointments she would never be offered. He sat across the morning room table and laid the terms out without preamble. The position was described as a state financial advisor to the Duke of Caldwell. It was not a household appointment. It was a professional appointment, which was an unusual thing for a woman to hold. And Whitmore acknowledged this with a brief flicker of something that might have been satisfaction. The salary was £150 annually, reviewed at 18 months. The scope included management of all investment summaries for the Investor Council, oversight of the estate accounts, and participation in the annual creditor discussions. There was a clause specifying that documents produced under this appointment would carry Eleanor's formal attribution. Eleanor read the document 3 times. She found 2 clauses she wished to amend, one concerning the duration of the initial appointment, which she wished extended from 12 months to 24 to provide meaningful stability, and one concerning the attribution clause, which she wished made more specific so that it applied to all documents produced under the appointment, not merely those formally submitted to the Investor Council. She wrote her proposed changes in the document margins in pencil, closed the folder and slid it back to Whitmore. "These revisions," she said, "are not unreasonable." Whitmore read the marginal notes. "No," he said, with the contained expression of a man who has been hoping for exactly this. "They are not." He returned the following Thursday with a revised document incorporating both amendments. Eleanor signed it that afternoon, went upstairs to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and pressed both hands flat against her knees for a moment before she stood up, put on her coat, and went to tell Lord Pembridge that she would be leaving at the end of the month. Lord Pembridge was surprised, and then he was alarmed, and then he said, "But who will do the accounts?" And Eleanor told him she would produce a thorough handover document and train whoever he appointed, and she left him with the account ledgers and the train of names she had been keeping for 18 months, in case exactly this question ever needed answering, and she walked back down the corridor feeling, for the first time in 9 years, the specific sensation of forward motion. She had not cried. She had straightened her spine, and she had continued. Caldwell Park was 17 miles from London, accessible by a good road, and bordered on 3 sides by tenant farms, and on the 4th by a wood that had been managed for timber since the 17th century. The house was large without being excessive. Gray stone, Georgian proportion, 4 floors, a walled kitchen garden, and a stable block that had been expanded twice. It was the kind of building that had been competently maintained and never loved, and Eleanor felt this about it the moment the carriage turned through the main gate. She arrived on a Wednesday in late November, with 2 trunks and the leather folio that had been her working companion for 9 years. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Laura Whitfield, met her at the door with the manner of someone who had been told what this appointment was and had decided, in advance of meeting Eleanor, that she approved of it. Mrs. Whitfield was 51, direct and Scottish, and she showed Eleanor to the rooms that had been prepared on the 2nd floor. Not the attic, not the back of the house, but a proper set of rooms with a writing desk positioned near the window for the light. "His Grace said you'd want the desk near the window," Mrs. Whitfield said, without explaining how he'd known. Eleanor set her folio on the desk and looked out at the park, the winter grass pale gold under a gray sky, the timber wood dark beyond it. "I'll want the accounts from the last 3 years," she said, "and the creditor's schedule, when you have a moment." Mrs. Whitfield smiled with her eyes rather than her mouth. "I'll have them on your desk by supper," she said. The accounts arrived before supper, along with a tray of tea and a small plate of shortbread that Mrs. Whitfield had not mentioned and Eleanor did not remark upon but ate entirely. She found the discrepancy on the 2nd day. It was not large, 340 pounds across 18 months, distributed across 6 separate farm accounts in figures small enough to avoid notice in any single review, but consistent enough in pattern to be, when mapped against each other, unmistakably deliberate. Someone had been diverting money from the farm maintenance accounts by recording fictitious repair expenditures. The handwriting in the repair entries was distinct from the rest of the ledger, slightly larger, slightly more pressured, and the fictitious vendors, when Eleanor checked them against the estate's formal supplier records, did not appear. She mapped the discrepancy across 7 pages of careful notation before bringing it to Whitmore, who had been making the journey from London twice weekly since her arrival, and who examined her documentation with the expression of a man finding confirmation of something he had suspected, but had not been able to locate. The previous steward, Whitmore said. Replaced 14 months ago, Eleanor confirmed, but the pattern starts 22 months ago, so there is an overlap of 8 months where the current steward, Mr. Radley, was present during the final transactions. I cannot determine whether Radley was aware of the scheme or simply inherited the pattern without examining it closely. I have not reached a conclusion on his culpability. She laid the annotated pages on Whitmore's desk. I thought you should see it before I spoke to him. Whitmore looked at the documentation for a long moment. I'll inform His Grace, he said. I assumed you would, Eleanor said. The Duke of Caldwell arrived at Caldwell Park 3 days after Whitmore's report reached him. Eleanor was in the estate accounts room when she heard the house shift in the particular way it shifted when he was in it. Not noise exactly, but a reorganization of attention, as though the building itself adjusted to his presence. He came to the accounts room directly. He stood in the doorway, looked at the 7 pages of documentation spread across the table, and said nothing for a moment. Whitmore said it was thorough, he said. It is complete, Eleanor said. Thorough is for when you have more time. He was quiet again, in the manner she was beginning to recognize as consideration rather than disapproval. Then he crossed to the table and looked at the annotated pages without touching them, following her notation system with the attention of someone who was reading it correctly. What is your recommendation regarding Radley? He asked. She had expected the question, and she had considered it carefully. Keep him, with a supervised accounts review process for the next 12 months, she said. The man is not the architect of this. He is careless, not criminal. Dismissing him loses an experienced estate hand in winter, and the next man you bring in will have his own blind spots. Caldwell looked at her, the measuring attention again, the surveyor's attention, and something else beneath it that she did not categorize. Very well, he said. He stayed for supper. He did not explain why. Mrs. Whitfield laid 2 places in the dining room, and Eleanor ate across from him in a silence that was not awkward, but was charged with something she did not have a name for yet. Something like 2 people discovering that the space between them has been miscalibrated and requires adjustment. He asked her about the creditor schedule over the soup, and she told him about the acceleration clause exposure she had found in the secondary farm mortgages. He asked about the timber wood management, and she told him she had not examined it yet but intended to by Friday. He asked whether her rooms were adequate. She said they were. The desk, he said, was the placement correct? She looked at him directly. How did you know I would want it near the window? A pause. Whitmore's report mentioned that your father was a surveyor, he said. I assumed you worked by natural light. It was not a romantic thing to say. It was a precise and attentive thing to say, and it landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending quiet rings outward in every direction. She had been working at Caldwell Park for 3 weeks when she encountered Lady Sophronia Vane for the first time in context. Lady Sophronia arrived on a Tuesday with her mother and 2 cousins for a visit that had been arranged before Eleanor's appointment, and which no one had thought to mention to Eleanor until the day before. She was exactly as she had been at the Pembridge Gallery, composed, beautiful, positioned with artful precision, and she swept into the drawing room with the confidence of a woman who considers every room she enters an extension of her natural territory. Eleanor was crossing the entrance hall with the quarterly expenditure summary when Lady Sophronia's party arrived. Lady Sophronia looked at her with the particular expression that managed to convey dismissal while maintaining perfect social surface. "Are you the new housekeeper?" Lady Sophronia asked. Eleanor was aware that the question was not an innocent one. She was also aware that the entrance hall contained 2 footmen, a lady's maid, and Mrs. Whitfield, all of whom were listening. "I am the estate financial advisor," Eleanor said. "I am afraid I cannot direct you to His Grace personally at present. Mrs. Whitfield will see you to the drawing room." She continued across the hall, down the corridor, and into the accounts room, where she set the quarterly summary on the desk and stood with one hand pressed flat against the account ledger for precisely 4 seconds before she sat down and continued the review. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. Lady Sophronia's visit lasted 2 days. During those 2 days, Eleanor attended to her work with complete and focused attention, appeared at meals when her presence was appropriate, and said nothing unnecessary. She was aware of Lady Sophronia's observation of her, the practiced social monitoring of a woman who considers another woman a potential disruption, and she did not perform indifference to it. She simply continued, because continuing was what she did. On the second evening, Lady Sophronia positioned herself at the drawing-room piano after supper and played with considerable accomplished skill. A Chopin nocturne, then a Schubert impromptu, then a piece Eleanor did not recognize, played with the careful correctness of someone who has mastered technique and not yet found what it is technique is for. Eleanor was seated near the window with a summary document she should not have brought to the drawing room but had, and she was not attending to it because she was listening, not to the skill, which was genuine, to what was absent. Caldwell was standing near the fireplace. He was not watching Lady Sophronia. He was, with the trained subtlety of a man who has learned to be unreadable, watching Eleanor. She became aware of this slowly, the way you become aware of a sound that has been present for some time before your attention catches it. She looked up from her document. He did not look away. There was a piano in the music room at Caldwell Park, and Eleanor had not touched it since her arrival, because it was not hers to touch and she was here to work. But she knew the music room existed, and she knew the piano was a fine one. She had seen it through the open door, and she knew, in the particular way she knew structural things about the world, that the Duke of Caldwell had not opened that room in a very long time. She found out why from Mrs. Whitfield on a Wednesday morning, in the kitchen corridor, in the way you find out important things, sideways, while both of you are attending to something else. His Grace's mother, Mrs. Whitfield said, rolling pastry with the steady pressure of someone who has been rolling pastry for 30 years. She played every evening. That room hasn't been opened since she died. A pause. 14 years. Eleanor thought about that for the rest of the day, in the particular way she thought about structural problems, not emotionally, but architecturally, understanding what load the wall was carrying and whether it had been carrying it correctly. The following evening she went to the music room. It was not locked. The door opened quietly, the room cool and still, smelling of old paper and cedar and something she couldn't name, the particular smell of rooms that have been closed for reasons, rather than simply for time. The piano was a Broadwood, she thought, or something very near it, and it was in better condition than a 14-year silence had any right to leave it, which meant someone had been maintaining it without opening the room. She sat at the bench and rested her hands on the keys without pressing them for a long moment. Then she played, not Chopin, not Schubert, the Haydn sonata her father had taught her when she was 9, simple and architectural and precise, which was the kind of music she had always loved, music that was made of clear shapes rather than ambiguity. That meant what it said. She did not know that Caldwell was in the corridor until she stopped playing, and the silence had time to settle. She heard nothing, but she became certain, in the absolute and unverifiable way you become certain of some things, that he was there. She sat for a moment. Then she closed the piano cover, set the bench straight, and went to the door. He was standing in the corridor, not performing the fact of being there, simply there, in his shirt sleeves, as though he had come from the study without planning to come as far as this. His coat was draped over his arm. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I am sorry," she said. "I should have asked." "No," he said. A pause. He looked past her at the piano, and something in his face was briefly unguarded. Not sentiment exactly, but the aftermath of it, like armor that has been, for a moment, not required. Please don't stop. She did not play again that evening, but she came back to the music room the following night, and the night after that, and on the third night she played the Haydn through to the end, and then, on a decision that was not impulsive but had been building for 3 evenings, she played the piece she had heard Lady Sophronia play that she had not recognized, because she had listened once and could reproduce the architecture of it, and added to it what it had been missing. In the morning she found his coat folded neatly over the corridor chair outside the music room door. She did not know what to do with that. She brought it to the accounts room and left it on the spare chair and spent 20 minutes finding the next discrepancy in the creditor records before she admitted to herself that she knew exactly what to do with it, and that what she was going to do was nothing, because what was between them was unspoken, and her position here was professional, and she had not come to Caldwell Park to become uncertain. She had managed creditor negotiations at 17. She could manage this. It was at breakfast, 11 days before the investor council meeting, that Caldwell's father arrived. The Earl of Denmore was 70 years old, precise and formal, and he looked at Eleanor across the breakfast table with the particular expression of a man who has principles he believes are legitimate and is about to apply them. "I understand you have hired a woman to manage the estate accounts," he said to his son, not quite looking at Eleanor. "Miss Marsh manages the estate financial operations," Caldwell said. "A woman," Denmore said again, as though the repetition would clarify something. "Her title is Estate Financial Advisor," Caldwell said. "Her work is the reason we identified a £340 fraud in the farm accounts that would otherwise have gone undetected for another 2 years. Denmore was quiet for a moment. "I am not questioning her arithmetic," he said carefully. "I am questioning the structural wisdom of the arrangement. The Investor Council meets in 11 days. They will see a young woman presenting financial summaries to a room of men who have operated in this sphere for 30 years. They will not take the summaries seriously. They will not take the position seriously, and I am concerned," he paused, "that they will not take you seriously." It was a fair argument. Eleanor recognized it as a fair argument in the same way she recognized Griggs's ledger revisions as numerically defensible but not honest. The argument was not about the Investor Council. The argument was about order, about what was appropriate to the structure of things, and she was the disruption. She looked at Denmore steadily. "The summaries will be accurate," she said. "The investors will have questions. The questions will receive correct answers. Whatever the council's initial disposition, the documents speak for themselves." Denmore looked at her for the first time, directly, with the measuring expression of a man who has just received an answer he did not expect. "She is right," Caldwell said. He was not looking at his father. He was looking at Eleanor, and there was something in his look that was not the surveyor's attention anymore, but something quieter and more decided, like a conclusion reached in private and now acknowledged. "She is also not required to justify her appointment to me at my own breakfast table." Denmore said nothing. He finished his toast. He left for London that afternoon. Eleanor was in the corridor when she heard him go. She straightened her spine and returned to the accounts room and spent the rest of the afternoon preparing the Investor Council presentation with the focused clarity of someone who has been doing this for 9 years and knows that the best answer to doubt is precision. That evening at supper, Caldwell's cravat was crooked. It had been crooked since luncheon, she calculated, a full 8 hours, tied correctly but having worked loose over the course of the day, so that the left fold was lower than the right, by perhaps half an inch. She had noticed it at luncheon and said nothing, because it was not her place, and because she was not going to be the woman who remarked on a duke's cravat. By the end of supper she had run out of reasons for restraint. "Your cravat has been crooked since midday," she said. "I thought you should know." He looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has just been surprised by something specific, rather than startled by something general. "Has it?" he said. 8 hours, approximately, she said. "It is the left fold." He reached up, assessed, and made a small adjustment that brought it marginally closer to correct without solving the problem. She watched him fail to solve it for 4 seconds. "May I?" she said, and was already standing before the question had properly resolved itself. She straightened the cravat in 3 precise motions, assessed the result, and made one final small adjustment to the left fold. Her hands were steady. His were very still. She stepped back. The distance between them was the same as it had been before, and also different in a way that had nothing to do with the distance. "Thank you," he said. His voice was even. "You were about to meet with Whitmore," she said. "I thought it appropriate." She returned to her chair. She picked up her list. Her hands were completely steady, and she put every available part of her attention toward keeping them that way. He did not say anything else. He simply stayed at the table for another 20 minutes, reading through papers, while she worked. Neither of them remarked on this. It was the most comfortable 20 minutes she had spent in company in a very long time. The Investor Council met on the 14th of December in the formal council chamber at Caldwell House in London, a room designed, like all such rooms, to make the assembled parties feel the weight of their decisions. 8 men, including Whitmore. 3 of them Eleanor recognized from Pembridge supper events. They had not recognized her in return, which was precisely what she had expected. Lord Denmore was present. He sat to the right of his son and said nothing during the introductions. Lady Sophronia was not present at the council itself, but Eleanor had passed her in the entrance hall on arrival, attended by her mother, and Lady Sophronia had looked at her with an expression that was not contempt, but its more sophisticated cousin, the expression of a woman watching a situation she is not certain she can control. Eleanor set her folio on the table, opened it, and distributed the 15-page investment summary to each council member. She said, "Gentlemen, I will present the Caldwell Estate Portfolio Financial Analysis for your review." She said it in the same voice she had used to present documents to Lord Pembridge's creditors, which was the voice of a person who has examined the facts and now offers them for consideration. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when 200 years of institutional assumption have just been lightly but unmistakably contradicted. She presented the farm cycle analysis first, the current position of each tenant farm, the creditor exposure, the margin projections for the next 3 years assuming current maintenance investment, and the projected improvement in margin if the timber wood management were converted to a more systematic rotation cycle. She included the £340 fraud recovery in the farm accounts, identified by source, documented by date, and explained the monitoring protocol she had implemented to prevent recurrence. A man named Hartley, the same Hartley she recognized from 3 Pembridge investment discussions, interrupted during the timber wood section. "These figures are theoretical," he said. "The timber rotation cycle you're projecting assumes market conditions that may not hold. The projection uses a conserved market estimate," she said. She turned to page 9 and set her finger on the specific table. The column on the left is the projection at current market pricing. The column on the right reduces that by 22%, which represents the lowest recorded pricing from the past decade. The rotation cycle produces acceptable margin, even at the reduced estimate. She paused. "If you would like, I can walk you through the sourcing for the market figures." Hartley looked at the table. He was quiet. She continued. She presented the creditor schedule analysis, the acceleration clause exposure she had identified in 3 of the secondary mortgages, the recommended restructuring that would eliminate the exposure at a cost of 14 months in extended repayment terms, and the net benefit to the estate's overall credit position over a 10-year horizon. A second council member, a man named Forsyth with a reputation for asking difficult questions, said, "How does a woman know about acceleration clauses?" The room held that question for a moment. Eleanor did not look at Caldwell. She looked at Forsyth with the steady attention of someone who has heard a variant of this question before and has never found it interesting. "The clause is on page 6, she said. "The sourcing is the original mortgage document, dated 1839, which I have available in its complete form if you would like to verify it." She paused. Knowing about acceleration clauses requires reading them. Someone at the far end of the table made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. She presented the investment portfolio assessment, the 3 underperforming holdings, the recommended divestment schedule, the 2 new investment opportunities she had identified and analyzed. She laid the evidence before them systematically, the way her father had taught her to present a survey. Not arguing, not performing, but showing, page by page, what was actually there. By the time she reached the final section, the room had a different quality than it had at the beginning. Not converted, not magically persuaded by the sheer force of her competence, because that was not how rooms like this worked, but recalibrated. The men were reading the documents rather than watching her read them to them. The questions had become technical rather than skeptical. She concluded, closed the folio, and said, "I am available for any further questions." The room was quiet, not the institutional silence of the opening, but the working silence of men reviewing what they had just heard. Caldwell had said nothing during the entire presentation. He had sat at the head of the table and watched her work with the measuring stillness that she now understood was his form of complete attention. She looked at him once, briefly, when she closed the folio. He stood. He said, "I think the council has reviewed sufficient evidence of Miss Marsh's analytical quality. I want to confirm, for the record of this council, that the financial management of the Caldwell estate is in Miss Marsh's hands, under a formal appointment, and that the documents she has presented today carry her name and her attribution because she produced them." He looked at the room. "If any member of this council wishes to raise a concern about that arrangement, I would welcome the specific concern." No one spoke. Denmore, at Caldwell's right, looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man completing an arithmetic he has resisted for some time, and finding, at the end of it, that the figures do not balance in the direction he expected. "The timber analysis," Denmore said. He was speaking to Eleanor directly, which he had not done before. "The 22% reduced estimate. Whose methodology is that?" "My own," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "It is careful work," he said. It was 4 words, delivered without warmth but without contempt, in the manner of a man who has a small amount of ground to concede, and has decided to concede it precisely. "You are correct about the acceleration clauses." Hartley had already turned to page 9 of the summary and was annotating his own copy. The council chamber did not erupt. There was no applause, no dramatic recasting of the room's understanding of itself. There was a long, suspended moment, and then the room reorganized into the practical conversation that follows a presentation that has been found sound, and the conversation was technical and specific, and treated Eleanor as the person in the room who understood the documents best, because she was. Caldwell crossed the room to her when the council had dispersed. He stood before her, and there was something in his face that was not the surveyor's attention, and not the contained authority he wore as his public manner, but something older and quieter than either, something that had been working its way to the surface for weeks and had, today, arrived. He extended his hand. She took it, still gloved, and he held it for a moment longer than courtesy required. "Thank you," he said, the same words he had said in the dining room after the cravat, but not the same at all. "I told you the documents would speak for themselves," she said. "You did," he said. He looked at her hand, then at her face, and she saw the decision forming in him, not impulsive, not performed, but the way all his decisions seemed to form, through a process of thorough consideration that arrived at a clear conclusion and held it. "Miss Marsh, Eleanor, there is something I would like to say to you. Not here." She was aware of Whitmore at the table behind her, of 2 council members in the doorway, of Hartley still annotating his copy of the summary. She was aware that this room was not the room for what he was describing. "Not here," she agreed. He did not say it that evening, or the next. He gave her the time she needed, which was what she had come to expect from him. And she used the time to do what she did with everything important, to examine it from all sides, to understand what it cost and what it offered, to satisfy herself that she was not accepting it from need or desperation, but from the free and considered decision of a person who has looked at all the facts and made a choice. The snow came 3 days before Christmas. He found her in the accounts room on the evening of the 22nd, working through the restructured creditor schedule in the lamplight, and he closed the door behind him, not urgently, but with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. "I want to ask you something," he said, "not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the most capable and the most honest person I have encountered in 14 years, and because I find that I need your company in a way that is not about the accounts and not about the estate, and which I have not made the mistake of pretending is otherwise." Eleanor set down her pen. She looked at the creditor schedule in front of her, not from distraction but from the habit of a person who needs a moment with her own thoughts before she speaks. She had known she would need this moment. She had been preparing for it. "I am not the kind of woman men remember," she said, "so I have been told." He was quiet for a moment. "That is the most inaccurate statement that has been made in this house since I inherited it," he said. "I have not forgotten a single thing about you since the first evening. The silver urns, the gray dress, the corridor, the music room." A pause. "I have not forgotten the cravat." She looked at him then, and there was something in his face that was quiet and decided and very clear, like a building that has finally been properly surveyed and found sound in every particular. "Yes," she said. He was still for a moment, absorbing the word. Then, with the particular kind of deliberateness that characterized every action she had ever seen him take, he crossed to where she was standing and kissed her hand, the bare knuckles above her closed fingers, the pressure of it brief and specific and warmer than she had been prepared for. "I will have Whitmore draw up the terms," she said, and something in her voice was not entirely steady. "I believe," he said, "that in this instance, the terms are not Whitmore's department." She considered this. "I will need to read them carefully," she said. "I expected nothing less," he said. They were married in February, in the chapel at Caldwell Park, in a ceremony attended by Whitmore, Mrs. Whitfield, and 30 of the tenant farmers whose livelihoods Eleanor had been quietly safeguarding for 8 months. Denmore was present. He had asked, the week before the wedding, to speak with Eleanor alone, which she had agreed to with the wariness of someone who has learned to verify before accepting. He had stood in the morning room and said, with the careful difficulty of a man for whom acknowledgment does not come easily, that he had reviewed her analysis of the creditor restructuring with his own advisor, and that the methodology had been confirmed as sound. He did not apologize. He did not pretend the breakfast table conversation had not happened. He met her eyes and said, "You know your work," and left the room, and Eleanor understood that this was the most honest thing he was capable of offering, and accepted it accordingly. Lady Sophronia Vane was married the following autumn to a baronet from Somerset who had excellent prospects and a suitable pedigree, and the announcement appeared in the society pages without incident. Eleanor read it with the uncomplicated goodwill of someone who has been made irrelevant by circumstances rather than by contest, and did not think about it again. By the time their daughter was born, in the autumn of 1848, Eleanor had completed the Caldwell Estate Management Manual, a 47-page document covering farm lease standards, creditor schedule management, investment summary protocols, and account maintenance practices, organized with the architectural precision of her father's survey reports and written in language that a competent steward could apply without formal training. Whitmore had arranged, at Caldwell's direction and with Eleanor's knowledge, for copies to be made available to 3 neighboring estates whose management he had identified as in need of improvement. A 4th had requested a copy the following spring, and a 5th the spring after that. It was the documentation she had always been preparing, in one form or another. It simply finally had her name on it. Their daughter was named Margaret, after Caldwell's mother, which had been Eleanor's suggestion, and which Caldwell had received in a silence long enough that she had understood it correctly as the most considerable thing she had ever offered him. Margaret was a serious child who walked early and talked early and had her father's stillness and her mother's precise observation of everything in the room, and she had a habit of escaping the nursery before the nursemaid had finished fastening her boots and appearing wherever her parents were working, which meant that she spent a great deal of her early years in the accounts room, seated under the writing desk, listening to her mother add columns and her father review estate correspondence. On a Tuesday evening in December, 2 years after the wedding, Eleanor was at the writing desk in the accounts room reviewing the updated creditor schedule, the lamp warm against the winter dark outside, the house settled and quiet around her. Margaret had escaped the nursery again and was asleep under the desk wrapped in Caldwell's coat, the same coat that had been folded over the corridor chair outside the music room, which he had never retrieved and which had migrated, by the logic of small domestic decisions, into her keeping. She became aware, in the way she always did, of Caldwell in the doorway. She did not look up immediately. She finished the column, set down her pen, and made a small notation in the margin that she would need to return to in the morning. Then she looked up. He was leaning against the door frame, watching her with the quiet attention she had come to understand was the most complete version of him, not the authority, not the reserve, but the man who had stood in a corridor outside a music room for 3 nights because he needed to hear her play and had not yet found the words for why. "The child is under the desk again," she said. "I know," he said. "She had her boots off this time." Eleanor looked down. Margaret's small feet were bare, tucked against the foot of the desk, and her expression in sleep was entirely her father's, composed and unhurried, and quietly decided. "She will freeze," Eleanor said. "She is wearing my coat," he said. "She will manage." Eleanor looked back at him. Outside the window, the grounds of Caldwell Park were dark and cold and exact. Every fence line and timber path as she had mapped them in her first winter here, and the lamp made a circle of warmth in which she sat, and her husband was in the doorway, and her daughter was asleep under the desk with his coat pulled up to her chin, and the creditor schedule was complete and sound and carried her name. She had not been the kind of woman men remembered. He had never forgotten her. She picked up her pen, made the final notation, and closed the ledger. The accounts were in order, the estate was sound, and the Marquis of Hartwell, who had said it at supper 3 years ago to 3 men who had repeated it, had said it about a woman who was, at that exact moment, keeping his principal investor's household standing. She set the ledger aside, precisely in its place. "Come in," she said to her husband. "It is cold in the corridor." He came in. He closed the door. He sat in the chair across from her, and she opened the next document, and the lamp burned steadily, and the room was warm.